Hello everyone. So, in the interest of everyone's time, I guess we shall start and we'll be recording this session so anyone who joins late can listen to it and see the recording. So, our first speaker is Igor. He is a senior consultant at Go.New and software architect at AVL. As a community member, he has been speaking pretty frequently at various events, conferences, and user group meetups. Personally, I know him for last couple of years, and hardly any month has passed where I see him not presenting at any meetup or the other. So, Igor, here's to you. You can start sharing your screen, and over to you.
Abhishek, you're presenting at the moment, so I guess I can simply start presenting. Yes. So, and you should be able to see my screen. Thanks for the kind words, Abhishek, and thanks everyone for coming. So, unfortunately, we are not there in Delhi, in India. That would be my preference, but that's how it is. I'm still honored to be able to present the topic online. So I'm going to talk about Entity Framework Core, certain features. I call them hidden gems because they are gems, definitely. So they can help us really develop things in a much easier way. And hidden because I don't see them that much in the wild. When I see it my customers and also in the projects I'm involved on, often I see a cumbersome solution instead of using these elegant features. As you can see, the talk is on the version 0.8, means certain things which I want to put in are still not there, but I will do that most likely during the summer and extend the talk with the topics. This is the condensed version, so roughly 30 minutes, and afterwards, please feel free to ask questions. So I will start now. Also, the presentation, actually, I don't have any. I'll jump to the code immediately. I have just a couple of slides to guide us. There are different topics which I want to cover, and they cover different kind of features. So what I want to start with is the performance. That's in general my favorite topic, not only in the Entity Framework Core area. And this is something when we're talking about the performance, this is my ideal picture. This is something what we always sell to the customers, like, super fast, super performant, whatever. And we know that what they get, sometimes it's not what we told them that they will get. So the first topic I want to discuss is one simple feature, very simple feature, simple to use, and it's related to performance, and I see it very rarely in the practice. So let's jump immediately to the code and see what is it. So the feature is called as no tracking, and I want to show you shortly what is it about. So I have a very simple example here of, let me just show you a simple model which has some authors, and in the context I just have these authors. Very simple model, and here's some typical code, let's say service, bit artificial.
I'm not
Yes?
sorry to disturb, but I'm not able to see your screen.
Oh, you cannot see the screen? The others?
Yes.
Oh, okay. There was an additional click needed. Thank you. Thank you for pointing it out. Just a second, says can't share your screen. This is, let me see now. Let's try again. Can you see it now?
No.
Not yet.
Yes, it is loading now.
Is it loading now? So can you see the code?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for pointing it out. I'm sorry. So what I have here, once again, some very simple example where I have only one entity called author, and within the context, I have the authors. And I have something called author service. Often our code is formed exactly in that way. And the author service has two kind of methods. One kind of this, like get authors, which simply read some things and forwards, read something from the database, read authors from database and forward it. And then we have methods like the other one, do something with authors that gets the authors and alters them, changes them in the database. So what you can see here is a bit artificial example in which I'm jumping over one of the authors if his first name is Ivo, and I'm changing the first name and the middle name to their abbreviations. What do I want to show with this example? So I'll start it. And what you will be able to see now is the following. After I run the authors, I have these authors in the database. They're all Nobel Prize winners in literature, coming from my countries and Austria and Spain and India. You're most likely aware of the last one. And you will see after calling the second method, I end up in this situation where the first one is not changed. That was the business logic. And then the other three are changed, whereas this author has first name and the middle name changed. The interesting thing in the whole is the following, and that's the magic of it, which I want to discuss. So I loaded four objects from the database, 4 authors, and there were only 3 updates sent to the database, as you can see, okay? Because the first one wasn't changed. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, in the first case, only the first name was changed, okay? In the second case, the first name and the middle name. And in the third case, again, the first name. This is quite impressive, actually. So it shows the magic in the background that happens in the background. Because if you take a look at our code, what we see in our code is the following. I'm just loading the authors from the database, as you can see here, okay? And at the end, once I'm done, I'm just saving them to the database. So the question is how Entity Framework knows which of them I changed and which properties I changed. Yeah. The feature which does this in the background, which does this magic in the background, is called tracking. So what's happening is the following: quite a heavyweight thing when you start iterating over the authors in this way. So Entity Framework will load the authors and create a snapshot of the data which was taken from the database. It does a lot of other things in the background, and that's let's say CPU demanding and also memory demanding process, where Entity Frameworks creates the snapshot of the data and does some other things which I'll not go into the detail. Why the snapshot? So that at the time I call the save changes, Entity Framework can calculate what was changed and send to the database exactly the database commands which are needed, the minimum database commands which are needed. And so as you can imagine, all this definitely, first of all, takes time, the processor time, and also takes memory to create the snapshots of the data and so on. Depending on what kind of data you load, it can be that you will consume quite some amount of memory. So that means this magic, the fact that we can write code in such a nice and easy way, we load the data, we change them, we save them, is definitely something which we want to have, but it comes with a performance cost. Yeah. Anyhow, in this example, that's perfectly fine, because we want to change the authors and we want to save them back. But the issue I have is the following one. In this example, when I just want to get the authors, okay, and I know that I will not change them later on, the snapshot and tracking is not needed. So that's the performance overhead we actually literally do not need. And as-not tracking is an Entity Framework core feature which allows us to tell to Entity Framework, listen, in this case, I just want to get the authors, but you do not have to do the magic in the background because I will never change them and write them back. So how that looks like, in this example, I'm here's the first one, the second one. I'm using that feature, and it's really very, very simple. Here it is. So the only thing you have to say is this one, as no tracking. You can see it here. Within the query, you just have to call as no tracking to tell Entity Framework that there is no need to track the objects. That way, you basically avoid the performance hit. Just to give you an example, I found a blog post where an author tried to measure in one example how big is the performance gain, and the smaller is better. What you can see here is in terms of memory usage, 66% less memory usage and left with 20% less execution time. Again, grano salis means with a pinch of salt. All of kind of results heavily depend on that, what kind of data you have. First of all, and how your query look like, what are you loading from the database, what needs to be tracked, and so on. But nevertheless, I always recommend to use this option because it's very simple. The only cost is to say as no tracking and give it a hint to Entity Framework, and there is no any other need to be done. Since in practice, at least what I see, most of the methods or most of the queries that go to the database, they return data compared to those that really alter data. And that's why I propose to set this option as the default one, and then tell Entity Framework other way around, track when it's needed. So how to achieve that? You can see it here. This is one of the configuration options. For, oops, sorry. Wasn't intended. Just a second. Yeah, do this. So this is one of the configuration options on the option builder. The feature is called Use Query Tracking Behavior. You can see it. You can see it here, and you can tell to Entity Framework with the query tracking behavior no tracking that the default option is no tracking. As you can guess, in that case, our original code, namely this one, will not work. Let me go to the original one. So if I write the code as I did it before, this will not work because once I call save changes, Entity Framework will not save anything because it's not aware of the fact that the entities were changed. And what you have to do in that case, again, it's very simple. You just have to tell Entity Framework to start tracking. And this is the option as tracking. So the opposite of as not tracking. My proposal is always to the teams, do it this way. Turn off the tracking by default because most of the methods will most likely be the querying methods, and then there where you need the tracking, turn it on. Yeah. So that would be the first hidden gem I wanted to show. It's not hidden at all, but as I said, I see it very, very rarely used in practice. And I would like to move to next topics. They are related to coexistence with the legacy world or the legacy databases, especially in the .NET Core development, modern development. We are talking about, like this super lightweight, endlessly scalable microservices, something, but we often forget or we want to neglect the case that in reality we have to deal with legacy systems as well. So they have to coexist. The situation that the database is already there and then we want to put the service on the top of it is something I see very often in practice. And then what I see is that we come to a clash of two worlds, the new one and the old one. And what I often see, the old one wins. when it comes to the model, to the entity framework model and the database. So in this case, it's very likely that the modern entity framework model which I want to have is different than the one which I have in the database, or that in the database I have some artifacts which are not presentable in the model in the most intuitive way. Entity Framework Core has several very useful features in this area, and I want to go through some of them. The first one are the keyless entity types. So what are the keyless entity types? Okay, entity types without keys. But what does it mean? I'll give you a concrete example. But first of all, let's see what are the entity types with keys. Those are those usual entity types we are aware of. So for example, in this example, I have a blog as an entity. An entity has ID, a blog has ID as its key. And I have a post, blog post, which also has ID as its key. And for those entities, those typical usual entities, I know that if I create a context, I just have to create a DB set of those entities, and I will be able to read and write those entities to the database. But in real life, especially in existing databases, we often have views also. And the views, you know that they're aggregates of existing data, and we cannot change the data which is in them, and as such they do not have, let's say, keys. Yeah, they are there to support efficient querying. And in this example, what I'm doing is something like this. I want to get the blog post count for each blog post, and let's say that I need it in a very efficient way, and that's why there is a view in the database. So when you see it here, let me just close our windows to be easier. What I have here is a simple view in the database, and what the view does, it just calculates. It's very simple. It just calculates the number of posts for each blog title. So I have a view in the database, and I want to get that data from the database. Until Entity Framework Core 2.0, no, it was 2.1, views were not the first class citizens, or they were not the citizens at all. So if you wanted to get the data out of the database views, you're forced to do low level querying and so on. That all changed with keyless entity types. So what is the basic idea behind them? I have an entity which is called blog post count, and which is designed in a way I want to have it in my model. It has blog ID, blog title, and the number of posts. Okay, but it does not have its own ID. So blog post count as a blog post count is a keyless entity, but still I can have it in my context, and I can map it to the database and use it normally in the same way like other entities. So how is it done? And it's very simple. So as you can see here, my blog post counts, just like every other entity, I declare them that I have a DB set of that type. The crucial difference is this one. So if you take a look at this line here, has no key. So we have to tell to entity framework that the blog post count is a keyless type, and we have to tell it that we are mapping it to a view, and the view is view blog post counts. Depending on how the columns in the view are called, this could be everything you need. But in this example, I went a step further to show you that with such entity types, you can do the mappings as you would do them normally. And this is something else I always insist on. Your entity model should be like a proper entity model and not the one-to-one taken over from, for example, from the view if the view follows different naming scheme and so on. So what you can see here is you can take a blog post count and then simply map it to the column names. And this is all what you have to do. Once you have it in your program, you can use keyless entity types in the same way you use normal entity types. So what you can see here is I'm accessing block plus count, and then I'm using wheres and everything else I want to get data out of them. And the entity framework will, in the background, which is something I'm going to show you right away, create proper queries. So if you see how the select looks like, here it is. You can see that entity framework, of course, translated the query, our wheres, and so on, into the proper one and uses the view in the background. The whole point here is if you used views before, and if you work with the entity framework, the classic one, or entity framework core before the entity framework 2.0, you most likely did it in a classical way, really writing queries on your own. Those days are gone. This feature is here, and you can really use it to access views in the database. In essence, that's it. Very useful. In the real life, I see it as very useful, definitely. And the second one, which I want to show you, which is also in this category of the coexistence of the old world and the new world, the feature is called value conversions. So what is it about? I took a very simple example simply because I saw it so many times. For whatever reasons, and I'm 100% sure you saw it as well, for whatever reasons, people tend to represent booleans in the database in very strange way. So in this example, I captured some of the ideas. So at least the things I saw literally in the past 20 years. Yes, Boolean, I have it as a true or false, really in the database. But then, for example, 1, -1, 0, 1, like numbers. Dane means yes, no in my mother tongue. Ja-Nein means yes, no in German. Then you have, of course, yes, no, and then the abbreviation of it, and see, no, and so on. So for some reason, there are plenty of strange ways to represent booleans in the database. And what I often saw was the fact that a model, entity framework model, was generated out of such a database, and then something what should be the boolean in the model is suddenly string or an integer or something else because it reflects the database. Value conversions and value converters helps us in this case so that we have clean models and that we have types in the models which we want to have, regardless of that, what's in the database. Yeah. So how it works, as you can see here, my BeTrue class has a couple of properties, and they are all of type bool. Yeah. And in the database, they have different types. Once it's integer, string, or are represented in a different ways. So the major idea here is we have to explain to entity framework that it has to convert the data while reading and writing to the database. So how it works? We can use so-called converters. They are built-in converters coming with entity framework. We can write our own. I will show you just this basic usage. So it's very simple. As you can see here in this example, I say that my property 1 - 1 has conversion. Okay, and so that means the bool in the entity will be converted to two values of type int, where -1 is false and 1 is true. Bool to two values converter is a built-in converter coming with entity framework. The others I use here are also built-in converters, and for me, just the fact that they are here shows that Microsoft recognized as well that this kind of mess is really often seen out there in a while. For example, bool to string converter for my language would be, for my mother tongue would be neda for false and true. And of course, since everyone has its own truth, I build a conversion which does something like this. So you can, for simple cases, you can declare the conversion in place. And this is, let's say, my conversion for Boolean to my own truth. What entity framework does in the background, I'll start the example. Let me show you the code. So in the code, I'm doing two things here. So first of all, I'm adding a new object of type be true. And as you can see, I'm putting all of these properties to true in my model, Boolean, and I'm saving changes. And later on, I'm reading from the database. So using some queries. So what you can see here is that entity framework did the insert into all this and inserted the values. But as you can see, the values here, the sizes are different and types are different and so on. So entity framework literally inserted in the background integers, strings, what's needed. And if you see here, the second part of the example, I'm accessing here my be trues, and I have some kind of a query here where I parent that they have to be true or false or whatever. So I'm in my query, I work with Booleans, and in the background, entity framework will convert that. Let me take just one example. For example, this one, you can see that entity framework will convert this Boolean expression into the proper one, where it's, for example, 1 - 1 or certain strings and so on. So that's the core idea behind value conversions. Yeah? That means let us explain to entity framework that we have different types in the model and in the database, and let's bridge two worlds. Yeah. This is a basic example. I plan to extend the code with several others, which I've seen in practice. And that's why it's the version 0.8. I'll give you a few concrete examples, which are also going to put in, just that you have a feeling. Typical one, we have a column in the database where we have a piece of JSON. Yeah. And in the entity framework, we want to have an object which represents this JSON. A situation I've seen was like having a string which literally maps to that JSON, yeah, and then some acrobatics which creates an object out of that string and so on, done within the entity itself. Yeah. Instead of having a conversion. Another one example. An entity had a list of links, like URLs, links, URLs to something. And in the model, what we wanted to have in the model is, of course, literally a list of strings. But in the database, I just want to have a single text column, single text column where all of those URLs are separated, like each of them is in a new line. Very simple. There are some other examples where the complex objects can be converted. So very useful feature. And as I said, I plan to extend it, but the basics are exactly this. I have different types, and I want to tell the entity framework how to bridge between them without blotting actually my entities, or even worse, without forcing my entities to have the same structure as the database, the existing database. Good. Let me see. Okay, so I have some time. These were the value conversions. The next thing I want to show is one simple feature, but I personally like it and I would like to see it more. It's related to diagnostics. Why I personally like it and why I would love to see it more. So let me show you an example. It's called query tags. So what is it about? I'll just start the example. doesn't matter what I do in code. What you can see here is some output of some logging and so on, and it often looks like this. So I do a lot of like performance investigations in general, like and trying to figure out. Often, is the first step is trying to figure out what entity framework is doing and sending to the database, getting the things in the logs and so on. And often it looks pretty messy in a sense. It's really hard to see, what's starting where and what's connected to what and so on. Query tags are simple features where you can tag a query with a certain text, and when you log it, you will get that text written out together with the query. So you can see now the same thing, but I just have some meaningful description of the query and some additional description of the query. The feature does nothing else but that. It simply tags a query with a certain text, so that when you do log analysis, you can easily figure out what's going on. To use it is extremely simple, and as I said, I would like to see it more. So let me show you. An example. The only thing I need here is the following. So in the first example I show you, I was simply displaying the output of this loop where I'm just executing some queries. And in the second example, this is what I was doing. So the feature is called tag width. So if you add this tag width, whatever in the query, and you want to capture the output for the logging purposes, this text which you put in, it can give some meaningful context around the query, and it can help you later on in the log analysis. Simple feature, but as I said, in my case at least, it saves me a lot of time sometimes. Good. The next one I would like to share with you goes now a bit in the direction into the overall architecture or architectural patterns behind entity framework. I hope that you do not know what this is, because it shows let's say, non-healthy blood. It's so-called anemic blood. I will not go into medical details now. Maybe you heard of it, so it's not a good thing to have. That's the point. And this term, like anemic, Martin Fowler, one of the most influential, definitely, individuals in our industry, a term to describe so-called anemic anemic entity models or anemic domain models. What are anemic domain models for him? So what he's saying is something like this, like anemic models, when you look at them, you will see that they have hardly any behavior, okay? They're just objects which are called them bags of getters and setters. What does it mean? So you create your class and it has nothing else but properties in case of C#. So if you take a look on the examples I have here, and I can start from the beginning. If you take a look at the author, okay, it's exactly that, a bag of getters and setters, a bag of properties. If you take a look on the second one, which was like, for example, blog, looks exactly like that. My post looks exactly like that. If you take a look on, I could say most of, or even any entity framework related example out there, for example, MSDN and so on, most of the classes look like that. They're just a collection of objects, a collection of properties. So something that Martin Fowler calls anemic object, or in general, anemic. They build anemic models, domain models. What's interesting, he's saying, I don't know why this anti-pattern is so common. He calls it anti-pattern because, of course, we are always taught that, like objects should be rich in behavior and so on and so on. So how come suddenly that something so important as our domain object is suddenly just a bag of getters and setters? I will not go into architectural implications of this. What I want to point out now is the following thing. So, in his article about Anemic domain model, he says some technologies encourage it. And this is an interesting part for me, because if you take a look at entity framework and the examples and everything, one can say, and I hear that often from my colleagues who practice domain-driven design, that entity framework encourages this way of thinking and building the application. What I want to show with the next features is that that is not the case. So yes, most of the examples for the entity framework look like I've just shown, but this must not be the case. So if you want to have rich objects, even for example, completely without properties or with rich properties and so on, and still map them to the database, entity framework supports that. So having a domain-driven design and a domain-driven model, which is really rich and not just a bag of getters and setters, works perfectly fine with entity framework, thanks to several features. And now I want to show you two of them. One is called backing fields. So what are backing fields? Yeah. I will show you two examples now. So one is this entity without properties. So what is it about? If you take a look at this class called entity without properties, you will see here that it has some private fields. Yeah, it has some methods. You can see them here that does something with those fields. It has some other methods with do some serious logic and so on. Okay, but there are no properties. Okay, it's a very typical, if you compare it to standard example. Still, I can explain to entity framework how to persist these kind of objects. And similar approach, if we have rich entities, in this case, I have an entity with rich properties. Rich properties means I have here some backing field, you can see it, but within the properties, I have proper code. So I have some proper logic going on. Getters are doing something, setters are doing something, checking and so on, triggering, whatever. So that means it's not just a bag of getters and setters. It really has some rich logic inside. For both of these examples, I can explain it to entity framework and simply say how to persist them. So how do you do that? So in this case, I will show you first the entity without properties, as I show it there. So in case of the entity without properties, so we have to use this method property to tell the entity framework I have a property, although you cannot recognize it, and it's called ID. You see it here, and entity framework will figure out that there is a private field called ID in the background. And of course, then you just map it to the column. So this is how it works using this property, and then just putting the name as a string. You can map the, in this case, backing fields back to the columns. And in the case of properties, which have so-called backing fields, what you want to tell to entity framework is, I have my property. This is some property with rich logic, but this one has a backing field. And so that means this triggers the clue that entity framework should use the field in the background, not to write to the properties directly. Yeah. In both of these examples, I didn't have constructors involved. Usually, in DDD, we also want to be able to create objects already just with certain constructors with predefined values and so on. This is also supported. So in this example, I have an entity which has a constructor, okay? And this is the only constructor. So there is no public constructor without parameters. So that means the only way to create a new entity is to provide these two values. Entity Framework is smart enough to figure out this as well and to use this constructor when it constructs the objects out of the database. How it works? It's a convention-driven. That means, as you can see here, I have a parameter called sum value, and Entity Framework will know that it has to map it to this sum value. I'm not going to more details because the time is running out. I want you to ask questions as well. But what I want to show here is it's also very simple to use it, and very similar. If I run the example, you will see that the Entity Framework literally calls the proper constructor and creates the objects. On other examples, I can persist the objects and get them back. So maybe I can just run this one example so that you have an idea what I'm doing in the program here. I'm creating these entities with rich properties and setting some values, or I'm creating new entities without properties, and then I'm adding them to the context, saving them and getting them back. And when you see how it looks like, you will see that the Entity Framework really does the proper job in the background. Let's go through it. Let's go through it just a bit. So, for example, this is the interesting part. So the inserts, of course, although we do not have any properties, Entity Framework will take the values out of the fields and put them into the database. And below also, when fetching them from the database, it will put them to the fields. And also, if you take a look at the output below, you can see that happens. It happens exactly that what we would expect. The feature on its own is very powerful, offers a lot of customizations, and I plan to expand this example as well with some additional examples. But the main message here is Entity Framework in its very basic usage. Yes, I will agree. Encourages, unfortunately, these bags of getters and setters, but it doesn't have to be that way. Yeah. That's it. There are some other examples here, but in this shorter version, these are those which I wanted to go through. Where to go from here? If you want to really get some good tips and tricks on Entity Framework Core in general, I highly recommend this book, Entity Framework Core in Action by John P. Smith. Don't buy it. Why? Because the second edition is coming out hopefully soon, by September, where Entity Framework 5 will be covered as well. This quote here, an expertly written guide to Entity Framework Core, quite possibly the only reference you'll ever need, I fully agree with it. The book is awesome, so this is something I always recommend in all my talks on Entity Framework Core. Then, regarding these examples, you can find them on GitHub. So on iRoncev Talks, all of these examples are there. You can find additional links. There are plenty of README files for every topic with some additional readings and so on. So take a look. And also, if you find the topics useful and you like the talk, please give it a star on GitHub. Matter of fact, if you're sitting in front of your computers, do it right now. That would be nice. Good. That's it from my side. It was pretty fast. I hope you managed to get the idea of these hidden gems, behind these hidden gems. Feel free to reach out. So my name is Igor Rončević, and you will find me everywhere as iRoncev. So follow me on Twitter. I promise I'll start tweeting. I don't do it at the moment, but I'll start. And you can find the examples on GitHub. And also, if you have any questions related to Entity Framework Core, do not hesitate to contact me through any of these channels. That will be it from my side. It's time to say thank you for your patience, time, and attention. Support, understanding, definitely cooperation. Thank you. Any questions? I think I don't know if we still have time. I was a bit.
Does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself or type in the question. You can unmute yourself.
You hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Very quite useful, contains professional tips and tricks. But my concern when developing APIs or web applications, it's all about the idea of the DTO, the these days and these data transform objects. Um, do we? I read a lot of many articles about this area. Um, do we actually needing this stuff about related to conversion data and mapping it or projecting it from this layer to this layer to that layer, or in the real business, it's actually um, is one layer only beneficial to the application or make it performing well? So all I need, it's only a small folder or a small project contains all let's call them the data carriers.
Okay, yeah. So to that question, it's a very interesting question, and interestingly, these are, I will call it architectural questions. They come up always regularly whenever I talk about entity framework. I have a talk on that topic. It's called entity framework architectural patterns, which is exactly about this. Like, okay, DTOs, do we need them? When? Yes. Domain-driven development. Is it really that useful, or is it too complex? When to have it? I will try to summarize it. It's not directly related to this talk, but I will try to summarize it in a few sentences because otherwise it would take a long to answer.
Sorry, my friend.
Yes.
Sorry, I got internet connection lost. Okay, you got my point.
Yes, yeah. So you didn't hear me. So I just wanted to say I have a talk on this topic. So architectural patterns, entity framework core architectural patterns where entity framework core fits in the overall architecture of an application, and then these kind of questions immediately pop up. How do we transfer data? Do we need DTOs? Yes or no? Out of that talk, what I'm doing there, I'm showing different architectures where entity framework core is used, and sometimes they're completely different or they oppose each other in a philosophical, in a practical way of view, but still people are able to build successful applications with all of them, and all of them has some pros and cons, definitely. So in this case, it really depends on what kind of application you're doing. You mentioned that why do I need it for some very simple case? Yeah. For very simple cases, there are many things which are not needed. My experience is often that the software which lives passes this very simple case phase and often evolves. And if it evolves on a very simple architecture, that can lead to problems. On the other side, having DTOs that run out of the control is also an issue. So I would say, in a general way, for the separation of concerns and in some, let's say, application of a decent complexity, having clearly this communication layer when it's clear what the domain layer is, this rich domain layer, what is doing, and what is actually given to the outer layers, definitely has sense then in terms of DTOs. Yeah. But the best thing always in discussions like this, the best thing is to really take a look on a real project and discuss the topics there. And as I said, maybe I will have a chance also to give this talk, Entity Framework, core architectural patterns in India. Let's see. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Please, it would be useful if you can share this article or this talk. You mentioned that you already have a talk about this.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Maybe just before. I'm sorry. There is in this book. There is a chapter. It's chapter 10. It's really good to discuss exactly these topics, like architectural, possible architectural approaches to entity framework. So, and also tackles also these topics. So, if you can get the book somewhere, maybe you can also take a look there. Yeah. I'm sorry, somebody else wanted to ask something.
No, it was me asking anyone if anyone has any questions.
Okay, then thank you all. That will be it from my side. I'll stop sharing.
Okay. So, hello everyone. So, my name is Abhishek and I am a full stack developer here at Qantas, an organization in India. I am involved in, I would say, like pretty early in Microsoft tech stack. I'm in .NET Core since 2014, in Blazor since 2017, and that's what today's topic is all about. Let me just start with sharing my screen. Okay, so the topic would be that how can we build component-driven UI in Blazor? But the first question would be that why would you care? Why do you care to even generate a component-driven development? So there is a periodic table of elements that was created by Josh Duck many years back. If I remember correctly, it was around 4 or 5 years back. So even our web page, everything is basically just a collection of elements. It is on the top, it is the HTML tag, then a head and the body, and there are tags which apply only to heads like meta, title. Then there are text only tags. So every tag in HTML has a very specific role. And all the application is actually made up of these small components. And if we see an application, it should follow like there's a button, then if there's a form, like we can have an input group with a label input, a validation message. So it could be a group. Then we have a whole form, or then we have like a templates, like we have change password, we have like profile, contact details, and all of the templates. And then we have the full page, which has the header, multiple templates. So everything on the application is actually made up of these small components. But in real practice, we actually don't use this. I mean, I can share an example what happened in my case around a week back. So we had an application, so I needed to make a change in how the styling of a particular thing works. So it could be like it was like I needed to change the background color of the row. So I made the change. I tested it and across all the areas where that particular component was being used, and I tested as well. But in QA, there was one area which was not working like that, what I expected. So what happened is that in that particular section, we were not using that component. We were actually, someone copied the code of the component and just pasted it. So no change happened there. And I'm sure many of you might have faced this thing with you as well. So I just want to request with all of you, don't be that person. You're making lives difficult for a lot of people. So this was all about why we should create component-driven components in our application. Our application should consist of small modules. I mean, there's nothing new about creating modules for us software engineers. We have been creating modules our whole lives, but still, it is something that we need to do it on a very regular basis. Now, coming to the thing which we all have made today, which is Blazor. I mean, there are many things, React, Vue. Why should you care about Blazor? So the current state of JavaScript frameworks is that you have several languages. I mean, I would, even with JavaScript, you have many pre-processed languages like TypeScript, CoffeeScript, and there are a lot of frameworks like React, Angular, Vue. They were before these full frameworks came, they were like Ember, jQuery views. They were templating engines, and we all have the vanilla JS as well. And then we have a lot of tools to choose from. We have Gulp, we have Babel, we have what linter to use. So basically, we have to make so many decisions when we make a single page application in JavaScript. Which editor to choose, whether we are using WebStorm or IntelliJ, VS Code. I mean, it can work on all of the areas pretty well, but will the extensions, the linter that you're using in VS Code work in IntelliJ? I mean, we all have to figure out the answers for all these questions. It's not something pretty straightforward unless you have a standard in your organization. So even these small things take up a lot of time. So, and one thing which happens pretty frequently is that I see a lot of people complain is that JavaScript is considered as an ecosystem, something which changes pretty rapidly. I mean, there's a pretty comic which goes around, like we have 14 competing frameworks, but it's ridiculous. So we should have one universal framework to which caters the needs of all of the users. So now we have 15 competing frameworks. So this was the scenario for JavaScript based frameworks. Coming to non-JavaScript based scenarios. So Blazor is actually run on a web standard called WebAssembly. And it's not just .NET which runs on Blazor. You can run R, Ruby, C++, Python, and a whole lot of other languages. So all these languages gets compiled to WebAssembly, and that's how we can get our C# or some other code running in the browser. And if we talk in terms of C# only. We have Blazor. We have Uno as a framework. Uno basically what it does is it takes the XAML of a UWP application and ports it to a WebAssembly app, much like Xamarin does to mobile apps. And Who is another framework, and who knows, some other frameworks might come in future. For tools, most of these .NET devs use IntelliJ Rider, VS Code, Visual Studio. I'm pretty sure there are many people who are using many other IDEs, but for most part of the people, these are the tools which I think are pretty common. For Blazor, so when Blazor started, it was basically targeting only browser. But Steve, who was the creator, and the other team at .NET, what they did was that they separated the logic, the UI rendering layer, and the layer which does all the calculation as to what component needs to be rendered when. So we have two types of hosting models as of now. We have Blazor in browser. What it does is it changes the DOM. Blazor runs on WebAssembly. It has all the DLLs downloaded to the browser. It runs with the mono runtime, and everything happens on your browser. Then we have Blazor server model, wherein everything happens on the server. It could be an IIS or any server which supports ASP.NET Core, and a signal connection is established to the browser. And over this connection, we send small packets, very condensed packets, for only the change sets that happen. For example, if you changed a text field, so only the changed DOM of that particular text field will be changed, not the whole page. So everything is good, but the first thing that comes to a big application is that what's the migration path? We cannot just go all in to an app to a framework which is launched. I mean, although Blazor is in development since around 3 years now, but the Blazor server side was made production ready in last September, and the WebAssembly one was made production ready last month in May. So it is still something which has not been battle tested. So it might not be something which you would like to do something right on. So let's do a quick demo to how we can use components in a existing MVC app. So what we'll do is we'll create a new application. Let's call it event. And you have to allow the MVC app for Razor components compilation. Otherwise, the MVC app won't be able to read the Razor components. So if I try to run this app, it's a standard Razor Pages app, nothing fancy here. Now what I'll do is, so the first thing that happens to allow any MVC app to support Blazor apps is we add the services for server-side Blazor, and so that we can connect with all the routes which are present on the Blazor components, we map the Blazor hub since it's happening over a SignalR connection. Now, just like Razor Pages has a view_imports.cshtml wherein we import all the namespaces firsthand. I mean, we can import all the namespaces in every component, but as a good practice, it's better that we import all the components at one place. So it's called imports.razor. And it needs to have all the namespaces for Blazor. We can include whatever we want. So one thing which I have personally faced a lot while doing the migration for MVC and Blazor apps is that IntelliSense doesn't work on first load. Sometimes you need to restart the VS, but it's just the IntelliSense that is not working. The application works fine. So I already have the namespaces. So all the Blazor specific things happen here, Microsoft ASP.NET Core components. So till now, what was happening was, this was a pretty static application. Now let's add some interactivity here. Let's create a component. Let's say fancy button. I hope the code is visible at this screen size. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
it's visible.
Okay. So on my index page, if you are in a Blazor application, the components would simply work by their name, but the Razor Pages does not recognize Blazor components directly. So as a bridge, we will use a tag helper which is created specifically for these components. Yeah. Intuitively, it's called components, and what you have to do is pass the type like I said, sometimes the IntelliSense won't work. But so there are three ways how we can render a component in any application: server, rendered, or static. So server would do is that it will not add any element beforehand unless the SignalR connection is established. It will just add a placeholder. So if you have something which is important for SEO, don't use it. Static is something which has no interactivity. It is for components which are just started to migrate and they don't have any functionality. And server pre-rendered is what it does is it pre-renders all the HTML as a static. It's a mix of server and static. It renders all the HTML in the Razor page, as well as places a marker which will then replace the rendered HTML after the connection is established. So let's use server pre-rendered. And we run this. So we have this HTML here, but currently it's not doing anything. So let's add a button. And have a variable now. When I start this, it has a button. But interestingly, what happens is if we go to the network tab, let me just unload this project and load this project. And just let me just change the mode to server. Oh, okay. So this button does not have any event attached. Sometimes slip-ups happen. Let's just I really apologize for this. Everything is there. Got it. So there's one thing which I missed. I mean, the whole signal connection will be established only, I mean, nothing would happen unless you have a connection. So it's not when we compile a Blazor app, so it does all these scripts related to Blazor framework in this special folder underscore framework. Oh. Now let's do it. We should start bringing to demo cards before any demo. Yes. Fine. Okay. So these slip ups happen, and I really apologize. So when we do a refresh, like I said, there's a WebSocket connection is established. I mean, it's not necessarily a WebSocket connection. It depends on a negotiation that happens between the client and the server. But all that complexity is handled by SignalR for us. We just care that a SignalR connection is established. But in most cases, for modern browsers, it will be a WebSocket connection. So every time I do a click, a message is sent across the network to the server. Now, let me just hit the breakpoint. The most interesting part. To ensure that actually a round trip is happening. Yep, breakpoint hit. I click again the network round trip happens. So this was the server rendered model for MVC apps, because MVC apps cannot run on Blazor WebAssembly on the client. So WebAssembly is possible only for apps which are purely Blazor. For anything which is a mix of MVC, Blazor, Razor pages, it has to be only server-side Blazor. Okay, so coming back to, so we saw how we can create a component inside an existing Razor pages app and use it. But what if we having a fancy button is all good, but what if I have to create an application wherein my components change their behavior based on what elements I pass on to them? For example, a data grid. Data grid can have a different number of columns based on different entities. So coming back to the same project, let's close all this and create a fresh Blazor app. Let's set this app does not have any MVC structure. So now what we'll do is I'll create a component. Let's call it table. And since we don't know what the type of the incoming entity would be. So this table component has to be generic. Let's call it the entity. And let's say why is the intelligence not working at all? Let me just restart this project once again. And now surprisingly all intelligence would work. That is something I do not like at all. So this is a property which will be passed as a parameter from the parent entity onto this entity. So let's create a class. Let's say users. User has some common entities like name, and age. Let's just keep only 2. So there are 2 ways wherein we can pass the template to the component. One way is this component does all the heavy lifting and we just give in the metadata. So it all depends on how the library developer or the component developer designs it. Let's do the simple one first. Let's call it head component. Enter. So now it can give us the head component. Let's call it tr td. And we can just print whatever was passed as is. So Now we have, if we check the HTML, we have a table, a header, and a body. But most applications will not do like that. So what we'll do is that each body needs to pass in like the data. I mean, each row has to print the data present on the row. So what we'll do is follow. And just pass in the row. Now, here every element will actually have the value passed here in a special parameter named context, which will be of type user. So, but since this does not have any data, nothing would happen here, because this is actually null. I mean, we didn't pass any data, so there won't be how would the loop work. So let's pass in some data also here. So now, when I run this, let me just rebuild this. Oops. I have to pass in as well the data parameter will take the users. And we have the whole table rendered. I mean, we can do all the styling as well, but from a functional perspective, this is all what it is. Coming back. So that is how you can create templated components. But creating components is all good as long as you're in one project. But what if you take these components and mix it up in a library and share it with many people? So there's a type called razor class library. And we'll just move this table component here. delete it from here. So now what happens is that since we are not giving any namespace here, it takes the namespaces based on how the classes takes the folder names by default. So now this component actually does not know because they are not in the same namespace. So there are two ways. Either I import it here like I did for in earlier case, or I can simply do it here as well. Reasonable. Oh, let me just. And now everyone should be happy. Yep. And when I run it, it runs happily. So in a nutshell, this is how we can create templated components and libraries out of it. I mean, that was my time. Any questions if anyone has? Anyone? Okay, I guess no one has any questions. So let's move on to the next session. We have a very special guest, Shawn here. And Shawn has been tinkering with the Compress in early 80s. I mean, that is something even a dozen years before I was born. So he has authored several books and several Pluralsight courses, and has given many conferences across local and international like TechEd, SDC, NDC, DevTech, DevConnection, DevReach. He's also runs as a consultant in his own company, WireMinds, and is a Microsoft MVP since 2003. So he's involved with Microsoft as an insider in ASP.NET and other things. So Shawn, here is to you.
Thanks. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yep.
Great. I'm going to try to take over the screen. Can you guys see my slides okay?
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Oops. There it went. So thanks everyone for being here. Today we're going to talk about versioning of APIs in ASP.NET Core, though a lot of what I'm going to talk about will also apply to ASP.NET if you're still working on the framework and not in Core projects, though my demo will be in Core. Most everything I'm going to talk about is supported in both platforms. Before we get started, he sort of talked about who I was. I'll just leave that up for a minute because that's not that important. And I want to kind of dive in, since we only have about 30 or 40 minutes, to talk about API versioning. So when you're creating APIs, whether they're for your own little project or more importantly, within your organization, or especially if you're using partners, once you publish it, it's set in stone because you're saying that other people have code that's written against it. And so these users, whether they're internal or external, will rely on the API not changing. And so you have to have a way to deal with change because, of course, requirements are going to change. You can't just live with the API as you envisioned it when you first released it, because it's probably not going to fulfill every requirement change that comes down the line. And so we want to have a way of evolving the API without breaking existing clients. Now, this doesn't mean that every time you release a version of your product that you should be making a new API version. It's really only when the requirements of the API changes that you should worry about changing your API versioning. I don't suggest you necessarily tie those together. And so the problem with API versioning is it's different. When we talk about .NET in general, when we talk about versioning, we can do this with assemblies. Assemblies can have different versions, and so that when someone is using your library and they deploy with your project, you can pick the one that is the version that you're using. But in the API, it's more difficult because it's sort of like all versions exist at one moment. You need to be able to support both the old and the new users. You can't just send them an assembly and magically it'll work for everybody. You can do side-by-side deployment where you have sort of two APIs for the two different versions, but usually that's not feasible because being able to figure out what version goes to which site can be problematic. And so the need ordinarily is to support more than one version in the same code base. The same app that is pushed to production should be able to support both. So with that in mind, there's some common API schemes that have been come up with, and I'll talk through a few of them. There's a lot of ways to version an API, and not all of them fit every use case. Not all of them are recommended in every case. If you are using a mechanism or you found one that works well, that you've been able to communicate to your customers, that's all that matters. You're serving your clients, not yourselves. So if you made it more difficult for you, but it's easier for your clients, that's a win for me. We're not always trying to find the graceful, perfect architecture. We're trying to find the thing that will allow us to serve our clients better. Again, whether those are the developers down the hall or whether those are partners that may be paying for the API. So let's talk about some of these methods. One of the most common that you'll see is this versioning in the URI itself. And the idea is that each version of the API might have their own path. And I start with this because this is the one we've seen a lot, and it tends to be pretty fragile. In other words, as customers change to a new API, we can't sort of behind the scenes move them to the new version. It has to be sort of an all or none because the URI is sort of fixed with that version number. Another common versioning in the URI you'll see is by using query strings. Query strings are, in my mind, preferable to URI path versioning, mostly because the version can be optional. So you can have the idea of a default version so that not every developer necessarily needs to know about the version that they're working with, but they can always opt into pointing at a specific version of your API. Again, this really relies on what users you're serving and how comfortable they are with different things. My preference in a lot of cases is to actually version with headers. So if we have a request, we can actually put some header. It doesn't have to be called X version. It could be called anything that makes sense to your users with the version number that you're going for. And this way, it doesn't pollute the URI at all. It's just something that goes across with every request. This allows us the flexibility that if this is missing, we can get the default version. We can even report back the possible versions. And this is the approach I take most of the time. You can also you also have to think about versioning of payloads as well, and that's where versioning in the accept header comes in. In this case, standard MIME types allow us to include version numbers or version information along with them. And so the accept header here is saying, I'm going to accept JSON from your application, but I'm going after the JSON that is version 2. Because remember, changes to the API aren't always in the way you're calling it. It may be in the shapes of data we're getting back from that API. You may be including more information or structured in a different way in different versions of the API. So tying them to the accept header or the last option I'll talk about here is the content type. And the strength here is that when you return data, you can return what version they're dealing with. Now, as we've talked about these different versioning schemes, you can see that they're getting more and more complex. And so implementing these can be kind of difficult. I've hand created versioning systems using ASP.NET before this system I'm going to show you is working. And it can be pretty hairy to figure out exactly the right scheme there, and writing a lot of filters to be able to figure out how to point people in different ways. And so luckily, Microsoft has come up with versioning that we can sort of plug into our existing APIs. So let's get to the code, because slides are slides, but that's probably not why you came here. So let me just show you. I'm going to be using ASP.NET Core project, and I'm going to be using Postman to make requests. This way you can see where all the versioning information is in. So no browser in this case. And this has a very simple API, has customers, orders, and products, and we're going to show how to get through all those. So out of the box, when we make a request here, we don't have any versioning information at all. The headers don't specify a version, and the headers coming back don't tell us anything about a version. So this is what a lot of websites or APIs are going to look like out of the box. Even though I suggest most APIs include versioning early on, so they're already sort of opted in for 1.0, our project doesn't have versioning at all handled. And so we want to change that. What we're going to start to do is actually open up NuGet, and we're going to browse for a project called API versioning. And you're going to see there's a few of these called API versioning with with Microsoft.ASP.NET Core, and then you'll see Microsoft.ASP.NET. And these are the two really big differences. One is for ASP.NET Core MVC APIs, and one is for ASP.NET Web APIs. The actual structure of the of how it's done is the same. It's just how it's wired up, because those systems are pretty different. So I'll install the versioning for MVC, since that's what I'm using to write my API. I'll go clockwise so that it installs real quickly. Woo! So we got it all in. And what does that do for us? Out of the box, it does nothing. But I'm going to go into Startup, where we wire up all of our services and do all of our configurations. And I'm just going to add into here services.add API versioning. This is basically saying I'm going to have some API versioning in my system. I don't actually have to change configure it all. It's just adding the API versioning in here. And what that essentially is doing is wiring into how controllers and methods are found from URIs. We'll see some of the ways that that can be handled. And if I go ahead and run this again, now that we've made that change, I might have to rerun the project, but let's see if it catches up. Yep. As we out of the box, once we add it, we can see that it immediately returns an error saying an API version is required but not specified. So out of the box, by just adding it to our project, it's going to assume that we need some versioning information on every request. We don't want that. So we're going to pass in a Lambda here so we can do some configuration of how API versioning works. So the first thing I'm going to do is say default API version. When someone comes in without knowing what API version we want to specify what the version is. And so I'll say new API version. Bring in the using statement. And this is just going to be one of a couple of different ways you can do versioning, with numbers or with date times. And so in here, I'm just going to say the default is going to be 1.1, right? I'm going to have a 1.0 and a 1.1 and use them both at the same time. So once I say the default API version is 1.1, let's see if this changes our behavior. Still none, because the API didn't specify one. So then we're going to add as a second one, assume default version when unspecified equals true. This is sort of the magic to say, if no one asks for a version, I'm going to assume that it's this default version. And so by doing that, we should be back in business because now it assumes we're looking for 1.1 of our project, right? And don't worry too much about the result here. We're getting and calling the controller. So let's head over to one of the controllers, the customer's controller. And this is a pretty typical ASP.NET Core controller. I'm using API controller and controller base, and I can add into this API version. And what this does, let me bring in the namespace. Doesn't it like that? Oh, because I haven't given it. And here I can just give it the version that is supported. Let's see what it doesn't like that. Oh, yeah, it's a string. I can say, hey, I want you to know that this is the correct controller when someone requests the API version 1 or 1.1, 1.0 or 1.1. And so this is part of the route information now. So when someone comes in with a request, whatever API version is determined, and if they don't specify it right now, it's being determined as 1.1, is how it's matching this customer's controller. It's no longer just the path of the method, but it's also what version they're requesting. So we could create a new customer's controller that, let's say, was 2.0 and was a completely different, implemented in a completely different way. And so we can map whole controllers to whole versions, but we also have a little bit more control. So let's come in here and make sure with that change, this should continue to work. It's going to go ahead and find 1.1 by default and find our call here. But let's go down to looking at one of the customers. So if I do /1, it's just going to return one customer, right? And you'll note in my result here, the orders are null. And I might decide, you know what, in 1.0 that was fine, but a lot of people have asked me to change this to have orders not be null. And so in my change to 1.1, let's go ahead and make a new method here, because I don't need a whole controller. I can have just a method change, because that's sometimes things that happen. And I'll say the version, oops, I did the wrong method. Here we go. So I have this method. If I make a copy of it, of course, it's going to complain because we have two methods of the same name. So I'm going to call the second one 1.1 because this will be our version that is for 1.1. And I'm just going to change this, and I'd already typed in the include to get all that information just so you can see it all work here. This is any framework code. It's not brilliant, but it should work. And so we have two versions now, but their mapping is exactly the same. How do we get it to know which is which? Well, we use another attribute that says map to API version. In this case, it's going to be, this is the old 1.1 version, the one that worked with the first version. And then now we can do the same thing, map API version. But this case, we're saying, hey, this is the 1.1 version. So depending on what the user requests, they're going to get the 1.0 or the 1.1. So let's see what happens. We run this again. And you'll see the orders are now included because what? The version by default is 1.1. So if the user didn't make a change, we're saying, and we've made the decision that we're going to opt them into 1.1 because this change shouldn't be breaking. Sure, they're getting more information, but if they don't use it, it's not really a breaking change. But you notice we haven't really specified any version yet. So let's talk about how that actually happens. So this will allow us not to have a version specified, but by default, the version that works out of the box is a query string. And so API version, I actually think it's by default, and we'll see how to change that. Let's say I want the 1.0 version of this. You see the 1.0 version that I requested by specifying the query string value for the what version of the API now is returning orders. But if I change this back to 1.1, it's then mapping it to that second version that includes the orders. And so in this way, before I get to how to change that, these are the two ways you're really going to change how methods and/or controllers are found. With the API version, oops, that should be a 1. The API version attributes and the map to API version. There's also going to be support, which I won't have time to show you, to actually do this with a fluent syntax instead of using attributes, if that's something that you prefer. I like it being in the controllers because then I know exactly how that mapping's happening, but not everyone likes that. So let's talk about that. So how this actually gets determined. Actually, let me show you one more configuration before I talk about changing that. And that is report API versions equals true. One of the interesting things by turning on this, it's actually going to give us a hint about what versions the server supports by including a new header. You may have noticed that header went from 5 to 6 because we now have API supported versions. And what does it do? For this API, it knows that it's supporting 1.0 and 1.1, and so it can report that. It allows the subset of your users to go, oh, this is an API that supported them both. Not super important, but it does come up here and again. So let's talk about picking from those different choices. There's something inside this system called a version reader. And so here we could say, what are we going to use as the API version reader? And here's where we can set how we're going to read this. Now, we can write one of these as well. If you have some very specific or need to support some old way of doing this, maybe it's a header, maybe it's in the URI, maybe it's something completely weird like a certificate, you can write your own API version reader. It's pretty simple. It just gets sort of injected as part of figuring out what version it is, and then the rest of the system takes over. But there's some built-in ones. So by default, the one that is used here is actually query string API version reader. Let's change our API version reader. Instead of API-version, let's just put V. Now, what this V does is say, what is the query string value that I'm looking for? And so in this case, this will now be V instead of API version. So it allows us to specify what that query string name is. That's not as interesting, so let's comment that out for a minute. And let's change this to one of the other ones that's common, which is new header API version reader. And here we can specify any of the header names we're going to support. And I'll say X version because that's just nice and simple. And in this case, by doing this, it's no longer going to read from the query string. So if I come back up here and say, oh, in the query string, it's going to give us that 1.1 version, and it's going to give us that 1.1 version because it doesn't know what this query string is anymore. It's not reading from there. So in order to get it, we have to add a header here. And let's go ahead and say X version 1.0. Now we're going to get the 1.0 version and then 1.1 to get the 1.1 version. And so this might be appropriate. Query string is easier for sort of lower skilled, I shouldn't say lower skilled, but people who aren't as comfortable creating network requests, especially if you're dealing with sort of people that are doing scripts or people are calling it from, let's say, WordPress or something, where getting to the headers might be a little confusing. Query string makes that a little easier. And so you might, as a third option, want to support both. And so they actually have this idea, and that's what you do is you say API version reader dot combine, And this will take one or more readers. So now we can have the version specified in either way. If we run it now and we have it in both places, and notice that they don't agree, and so we actually get an error saying you requested 10 and 11. You can only do it once. So we'll take this off, leave it in the header, and we'll get the right version. And so kind of the magic of what this little system does here is allows you to incorporate API versioning at a pretty simple level so that you can just have your API versions handled directly at sort of the code level. There's a couple of other schemes here that are interesting. They also allow using namespaces. There's a namespace-based reader that basically you would have a directory for 10 and have all your controllers, and have directory 11 with all your controllers if you were going to have duplication of code. And that made sense to you because maybe those two versions are so different that trying to get it to work in one controller might not make sense. It might just make the code really ugly, and you really do just want to have one version, two different controllers that handle the different versioning. So it's really flexible in that way that you can decide how you're going to version, how you're going to read those versions as well. Questions? Go back to here and see if I can turn on the comments. It was here a minute ago.
The chat one on the top, the chat icon on the top.
Oh, there. Thanks. Any questions from anyone? The code and the slides will be available on my website, wildermuth.com, and the next day or two, probably by Monday. But if not, I appreciate everyone for being here. I'll just show real quick two links here. One is where to get the Microsoft API versioning, and then wildermuth.com for the demo and the slides. And I appreciate you taking your Saturday night out for me.
Okay. Thank you, Shawn and Igor, for coming up and giving us wonderful sessions. And thank you to all the attendees who are here with us. I guess that's a wrap.